History remembers the fall of Valadorn, but few people know how quietly it actually began. At first, everything looked normal. Markets in Aurelian were still full of laughter. Wheat fields still glowed beneath the summer sun. Travelers still crossed the kingdom's great marble roads beneath banners that had flown for centuries. But far from the capital, something had already changed. Caravans were vanishing in the forests. Garrisons were disappearing overnight. Former soldiers, once loyal to the crown, had begun raising weapons against it. The royal court believed they could crush the rebellion with force. Instead, the king made a decision that would set the entire kingdom on fire. And within a single year, the most powerful empire in the region would vanish. But the most shocking part of Aladorn's fall happened on the night the city gates opened. But the most unbelievable moment in this story happens when the people of the capital make a decision no one expected. And the final mystery of this fallen kingdom is what really happened to its last king.
Everyone believed the kingdom of Valadorn would last forever. For centuries, its crimson banners, stitched with a silver crown, had flown proudly from the cliffs of the western sea to the black pine forests of the east. Traders traveled safely along its marble roads. Cathedral bells echoed across fertile valleys. At the heart of it all stood the fortress city of Aurelian, carved directly into towering white cliffs that caught the sunlight like a blade. From its vast halls, kings ruled an empire that seemed unshakable. But kingdoms rarely collapse in a single moment. They fracture slowly. They decay quietly, and sometimes they forget the very people who built them. The final summer of Valadorn arrived warm and golden, as if the world itself refused to believe the end was near. Fields of wheat swayed beneath bright skies, and the markets of Aurelian bustled with merchants, musicians, and travelers who filled the streets with laughter. High above the city, inside the immense Hall of Oracles, sunlight poured through towering stained-glass windows that told stories of ancient victories and long-dead kings. Upon the throne sat King Halbrecht III. The chamber was so vast that even the quietest whispers struggled to reach the far walls. Yet that day the silence was broken by tension as the royal court argued below the throne. Chancellor Moreau stood with a scroll clenched tightly in his thin hands. His voice trembled as he spoke. Grain shipments from the southern provinces had stopped entirely, he explained. Farmers claimed bandits were raiding the roads and seizing caravans before they could reach the capital. Before the murmurs in the hall could settle, General Varric stepped forward. His armor clinked softly with each movement. "Not bandits," he said. The room grew still. "Rebels." The words spread through the court like a cold wind. According to Varric, many of them were former soldiers' men, who had once sworn loyalty to the crown but now carried weapons forged in Valadorn's own armories. Villages were sheltering them, garrisons were vanishing, entire patrols were failing to return. King Halbrecht listened with heavy eyes. For months, the reports had grown worse. Riots in eastern towns, taxes refused, soldiers deserting their posts. It felt as though the entire kingdom was quietly slipping away. Finally, the king spoke. "Send troops." Varric hesitated before answering. They already had, he explained. But every time royal forces entered the forests, the rebels simply vanished. They knew the terrain too well. By the time soldiers arrived, the enemy was gone. The hall fell silent. Then the king gave a command that none of them expected, and burned the forests. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Even Halbrecht seemed surprised by the words that had left his own mouth. But he did not withdraw the order. And with that single command, something inside Valadorn began to crumble. Soon smoke rose across the kingdom. First it appeared as distant gray pillars twisting into the sky above the southern hills. Then entire valleys began to burn. Villages disappeared overnight. Wheat fields that had fed the kingdom for generations were reduced to ash. Refugees flooded the marble roads leading toward Aurelian. Endless lines of wagons creaked beneath the weight of everything their owners could carry. Families walked beside them with children wrapped in blankets and frightened animals tied to ropes. And everywhere they went, they told stories. Stories whispered beside campfires. Stories passed from one frightened traveler to another. Royal soldiers hanging farmers from oak trees. rebels poisoning wells, entire garrisons discovered with their throats cut while they slept. No one could tell which stories were true anymore. Captain Alira Thorne rode north with what remained of the 3rd Legion. Her armor was stained with soot, and the soldiers behind her looked more like survivors than an army. They passed fields of blackened earth where golden crops had once grown. Beside her rode a young soldier who stared silently at the ruined land. "We were meant to protect them," he whispered. Lyra did not answer. Ahead, the road was clogged with refugees. Wagons stood wheel to wheel as families struggled through the mud and snow. Suddenly, a woman rushed forward and grabbed the reins of Alira's horse. Her face was pale with fear. "The rebels are coming," she pleaded. "You must defend the town." Alira looked back at her soldiers. 200 men remained. Many were wounded. Most were exhausted. And somewhere beyond the hills, thousands of rebels were gathering. She gently pulled the reins free. "We march for the capital," she said quietly. The woman's hands slowly fell away. The Legion continued forward, leaving the refugees behind. Soon after, smoke began rising once again in the distance. Winter arrived early that year. Snow fell across burned villages and silent roads. Rivers froze. Wolves began wandering near abandoned farms. Even inside Aurelian, the air had grown heavy with fear. The royal court had shrunk. Many nobles had quietly fled the city while they still could. Others had vanished without explanation. One evening, Chancellor Marrow stood before the throne again, his voice weaker than before. "The treasury is empty," he said. King Halbrecht stared at the floor. "The mines?" he asked after a long silence. "Captured. The ports blockaded." Even the palace guards had begun whispering behind closed doors. Beyond the towering walls of Aurelian, something enormous had begun to gather. Across the dark plains, thousands upon thousands of campfires burned in the night. The rebels had arrived. They were not just soldiers anymore. They were farmers, laborers, former nobles, criminals, entire clans from the eastern forests. People from every corner of Valadorn. And they carried no single banner, only black flags. The siege of Aurelian lasted 3 terrible months. Food disappeared first, and the horses, then the leather from belts and boots. Desperate citizens boiled scraps of anything they could find to survive another day. The once crowded streets of the capital fell silent. At night, the sound of slow drums echoed from the rebel camps beyond the walls, beating patiently beneath the frozen sky. Across the plains, rebel fires stretched endlessly across the darkness, like a second sky filled with burning stars. "They're waiting," Alira said. Varric nodded grimly. "They know we'll starve." Alira looked down into the empty streets of the city she had sworn to defend. Once those streets had been filled with music and merchants and laughter, now they were hollow. "How did it come to this?" she asked quietly. The old general gave a tired laugh. "Empires collapse long before the walls fall. But in the end, it was not the rebels who destroyed the city. It was the people inside it." On the 93rd night of the siege, starving citizens gathered in the lower districts of Aurelian. Bakers, laborers, children, and even soldiers who had abandoned their posts filled the narrow streets. Someone brought a hammer, someone else carried a torch. The southern gate had stood strong for 2 centuries, surviving wars and storms and countless threats. But it could not survive hunger. Flames crawled across the massive wooden doors. Chains snapped. Iron hinges groaned beneath the pressure of the crowd. Captain Alira arrived at the plaza just as the gate began to open. Beyond it stood thousands of rebel soldiers waiting in the darkness. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the rebels began to walk forward, not charging, not shouting, simply walking, like a tide returning to the shore. By dawn, the palace gates had been broken, and rebel fighters flooded through halls of marble and gold. They expected one final battle, expected the king to make a last stand upon his throne. Instead, they found silence. When they pushed open the great doors of the throne room, the chamber was empty. The throne of Valadorn stood alone in the center of the hall. Only the crown remained, resting quietly on the seat. King Halbrecht III had vanished during the night. Some claimed he escaped through hidden tunnels beneath the city. Others believed the cliffs below Aurelian held his body in the cold sea. No one ever discovered the truth, and the last king of Valadorn was never seen again. Years passed. Grass now grows between the marble stones of Aurelian's streets. The great towers still stand against the wind, but their banners are long gone. Travelers sometimes wander through the ruins of the palace, stepping carefully through halls that once held the power of an empire. Eventually they reach the throne room. The crown disappeared long ago, but carved into the stone wall behind the throne are the fading words of Valadorn's ancient motto, "Endless Dominion." The wind moves through the broken windows, and the fallen kingdom answers only with silence.